now.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we'll be journeying with the moon while Jupiter's in Cancer. And each month we'll release an episode to coincide with the new moon. And today's episode is the moon in Gemini. I'm Tara, an astrologer from the UK.
I'm Helen, an astrologer from Scotland, also in the UK.
Great. And we were just saying, weren't we, that this is the kind of wrap up to the series. We started almost a year ago when the new moon was in Cancer, and we've come all the way full circle to the new moon in Gemini. So it's been an absolute pleasure doing this with you. I wanted to start off by saying that, Helen, and yeah, let's
Likewise.
dive in. We're actually recording a Virgo rising chart. We've got, I think, Gemini Sun on the MC, so very mercurial. So apologies in advance if this is scattered and chaotic, but yeah. So shall we look at this new moon? So it's on the
Yeah,
15th
let's.
of June. Okay, so it's a Gemini rising chart, which puts not only the new moon there, but also the chart ruler is Cancer, Mercury in the second house. And I don't know about you, Helen, but when I was kind of looking at the chart, it felt like that new moon is pretty much unaspected because it doesn't see Mars in Taurus, it doesn't see its ruler Mercury in Cancer or Jupiter. And then even, Venus is, sextile by sign, but not by degree. And I know you mentioned that I did see the sextile to Chiron, but I just kept getting drawn back to the fact that it was unexpected, which I think is a little bit ironic given Gemini wants to be in all of the things all of the time, and but here it is kind of chilling by itself. So it feels a bit more like a wild card. It feels like it's kind of acting in a vacuum almost. And I think this new moon, for me, when I'm looking at the chart, is kind of highlighting the distinction between doing, which is very Gemini, and feeling, which is very Cancer. The fact that I think it's interesting that this new moon's ruled by this Mercury in Cancer. And I think this new moon might be looking at the challenge of quieting a loud mind. This Gemini season, whenever we've kind of got that kind of mercurial energy, the mind can be quite loud, can be quite restless. And so for me, I feel like this new moon's definitely kind of saying, instead of asking like, what do I think about this? It's more around the question changes to how does this actually feel in my gut? Like, how am I feeling about this? And I think because there's no aspects or main aspects to this Gemini energy, there's no kind of constructive outlet or boundary. So there might even be this element of retreat almost. Um, and also the fact that we've got, I don't know, it feels like there might be this also call for us to have this kind of digital detox because, it's not just the mind, it's all of the tech that we use to communicate with people. But I think this Cancer Mercury softens that into like, can we communicate in person? Can we connect through belonging? And while this Venus Pluto opposition isn't really, functioning in a direct aspect to the new moon, it still colors the chart. And I think it's quite interesting that Venus would have just moved into Leo, so instantly making that opposition to Pluto.
Mhm.
So again, it might be about this kind of heartfelt, kind of creative piece rather than this collective digital overload where we're just bombarded by constant news and thoughts and ideas of other people. So that's the feeling that I'm getting from this chart. I don't know about you. What have you kind of seen in it?
Yeah, some similar to that, and some maybe with a slight difference in emphasis, because, like you, I kind of saw that new moon pretty much unaspected, at least in any traditional sense. Maybe a couple of whole sign aspects with the sextile to Saturn and to Venus, which are not quite in trine to each other by degree, but there's maybe something there. But it's really an unhampered Gemini moon. It's in that third solar decan, and it does feel quite frenetic. That was the word that came to mind thinking about that energy. It's like you say, you know, the Gemini is quite a hands-on energy. It's airy, but it's also, you know, quite kind of wants to get in about things and quite curious and restless. I think the co-presence with Uranus, even though it's risen and it's above the ascendant, so it's kind of
Mm.
it's in the first whole sign house, but so it's you know, it's in a slightly different relationship with the ascendant, but it's amping up further that kind of maverick, um kind of unconventional energy that we sometimes can feel with Gemini. And on the Plutonian, I totally agree, because I think that that newly formed Venus-Pluto opposition is definitely shaping the vibes here, and the Pluto is trining the ascendant locally here, which is at 10 degrees, certainly here in Scotland. So I feel like there is a Plutonian kind of underbelly to that. And you mentioned, because just before we came on, we were thinking about the aspects, and I was thinking about that kind of almost sextile with Chiron. That's the closest aspect that there
Mm.
is, and Chiron is in this uber anoretic place where it's really getting on, in the 29th degree. Aries is the longest sign for Chiron, and it's in its
Mm.
elliptical orbit, and so that, for those of us with Chiron and Taurus, and I know you and I are going to talk about this separately because we, you know, our whole generation coming up for the Chiron return. And so this feels like such a long, dramatic exit. And I feel like Chiron in the mix there, together with, there is that form of mutual reception, although Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant, and the new moon is not aspecting them. It's, it is ruling. So Mercury is ruling the moon is ruling Mercury, and then there's the Venus Pluto and the Chiron in the mix. So I do wonder if there's something about communicating about relationships and feelings. Likewise to what you said, that although Gemini is this pure intellectual energy, there's a lot about feelings coming up here, in
Mm.
terms of if we want to use this energy, maybe a good way to do that is around asking those questions about, what do I really feel? What does my body need? Because again,
Mm.
even a Gemini moon is still the moon, and it's still connected to that embodied kind of nature of life. And so that was kind of what was coming to mind looking at this chart for me.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think I completely missed the mutual reception, and I'm really glad you picked it up because I think it reinforces what we've both been saying around doing and feeling. And I think it highlights how the body and the mind, while separate, are still also one. And, if you've got an overactive mind, you might feel it in the body, and it's how you kind of lean into both of those. I think that Uranus energy is definitely coloring a lot as well, in terms of amping up that frisson almost. And yeah, I mean, how long has Aries Chiron been at the 28th,
A million
29th
years.
degree? It just feels like it's been there forever, and we're all just waiting for it to just move into Taurus and just come on, give us the worst you've got. I mean, it's going in 2 weeks, the 19th of June. So yeah, we both said, didn't we? It's been popping up in almost all of the most recent new moons, like as if to say, yeah, don't forget about me in this lesson that you've got to be learning. Um, so yeah, it'd be interesting to see how this actually feels. But yeah, I think it's interesting that we've also got this Venus-Pluto opposition, which I think will definitely add its own. I mean, I think generally this year for fixed signs, we've got, this Jupiter moving into Leo, we've got this Scorpio Venus retrograde, which will be what it is. And then also obviously we've got Taurus, Chiron. So we've got all of these quite big hitters in the fixed sign. So I would say if you do have any kind of prominent placements in the fixed signs, the next 6 months are going to be, yeah, interesting, complex, lots of different things going on. And this is probably, all of these charts are kind of pointing to those stories that are coming up.
Absolutely. And if I could add one more thing as well, which occurred to me about that Mercury, which is again kind of ruling all that Gemini stuff, is that I think it's past its shadow point now, which I think was it will retrograde back to about 16 degrees. So there's almost the start of that story possibly as
Yeah.
well in terms of Mercury slowing down, gearing up to go retrograde within the Cancer sections of our charts, and it's again amplifying that theme that we both picked up on about the intersection between thoughts and feelings, emotions and communication.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, there's so much going on. I've actually probably subconsciously blocked out the fact that Mercury was is going to station at some point later this month, but that is a really good point, and especially like you said, it would have already passed the degree that it's going to station, which is yeah, super interesting. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time. I am looking forward to it. This new moon will be opposing my natal moon. So I have a lot of love for Gemini energy, generally speaking. So yeah, maybe that's a nice way to lead into kind of general significations of Gemini before we move into
Mm.
our kind of charts that we want to discuss. So I don't know, what have you been thinking about in terms of Gemini? Because do you have any Gemini placements? I know you've got a progressed Gemini moon, obviously.
Yeah, so I have my lot of fortune IC, which has currently got Uranus on it, and North
Fun.
Node in the later degrees. So
Mm.
that's so there's almost, even though there's no planetary placements, there's almost enough there to say that there's something. Interestingly, my lot of fortune is more or less the ascendant and lot of fortune in this new moon chart, which it feels like it will
Mm.
maybe line up then in a way that be kind of significant. So yeah, in terms of Gemini, I suppose what I tend to think of is you know keywords, I suppose, like curiosity and playfulness and versatility and adaptability and there is an element of trickster energy as well.
Mm.
Like I think with them, and I'm thinking about people I know with prominent Gemini placements who can be like that. If you get on the wrong side of them, it's not that they'll like charge at you. It's worse, and also just the sense of maybe fun that comes with it as well. And some of that I think came through quite strongly in the sort of celebrity examples that I was looking at as well. What about yourself? What comes to mind?
Yeah, very similar words, actually, keywords. I've got like versatile, curious, open-minded, free-spirited, adaptable forms of communication. But then I was also thinking how it's a different kind of mercurial energy compared to Virgo, because although they're both mutable, Virgo does have that grounded earthiness, whereas Gemini is this mutable air. So there's this constant need or craving, stimulation. I think Gemini can get bored by steady and predictable. And Gemini energy always reminds me of the saying, like a jack of all trades is a master of none. But most people don't realize that the rest of the saying is, but oftentimes better than none. And I think that is a really good way to kind of look at Gemini. So yes, it can be scattered. Yes, it can be indecisive, but it's still, is it better to know a little bit of everything than not know nothing at all? I mean, I think so. And I do love, I don't know whether it's just the mutable air combination that just makes them very quirky. I love how kind of specifically the effortless, like a lyrical versatility, like how clever their razor sharp like wordplay can be. And they it's interesting because maybe not the moon itself, but Gemini suns certainly dominate like the hip hop scene. So you've got like Kendrick Lamar, Tupac, Kanye, Biggie, Andre 3000, Lauryn Hill. And if you like are into hip hop and you listen to the way that they can just weave words together, I think it's just a beautiful aspect of like Mercury. I think the trickster part of it comes in when you've got like just if you listen to Kendrick and the way he can really just deliver something so clever and it really gets you thinking. And you just think, God, how do you even like how's your mind even thought this up?
I love that point, and I think absolutely when I think of rap and hip hop, and that is the lyrical cleverness and the sophistication of the way that words are put together, and the quickness as well. That's another
Mm.
kind of Gemini and aspect as well, isn't it? Where you think I would trip myself up trying to even say that, let alone how do you come up with that? I think it's incredible, and people do it live in like rap
Mhm.
battles where they stand up and do it, like off the cuff. I've always thought that was incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I just think, how are you doing this just off the cuff? It's just so clever. And it's just and it's not just the words, it's the delivery, it's the way they say it, it's how they, add weight to certain words so that the way that it flows. So it's very musical. Like I think people think rapping is really easy, but it actually has its own kind of instinctive flow that actually, if me or you, we're not going to, don't worry, started rapping, it wouldn't sound like that at all. So I think it's just, I love that kind of Mercury element. And it's, yeah, like I said, very different in Gemini compared to Virgo.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's move on to looking at some famous, well-known Gemini moons. Me and Helen, well, we probably should have, but we didn't actually discuss who we were even going to bring to the table today. And it's been great because we're actually bringing very different kind of energies, which I think again shows the versatility and yeah, just how adaptable Gemini can be. So I think in the end, we've actually brought some really interesting and diverse examples. So I'd love to hear about your examples and what you've kind of picked up on.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. So the first one that I thought I would talk about a little bit, not someone I'm an expert in by any means, but someone who's kind of been part of the cultural fabric since I was very young in the 80s, is Kylie Minogue, who's got her moon in Gemini. And her chart is a Cancer rising chart. So that Gemini moon is the chart ruler. And it's part of a massive Gemini stellium where she's got every personal planet, so both luminaries. It's a new moon, and
Wow.
she's got Mars, Venus, and Mercury there as well. And I think so. There's such archetypal Gemini and energy coming from her that ordinarily I might think it would be hard to kind of pull out the moon from that, but because it rules the ascendant, I think there's enough that we can say about that even without being a Kylie Minogue expert. So some of the things that are really striking about Kylie and her career has been her adaptability and versatility. So she began as an actress in a soap opera, and that's how I first knew her. And she from there she broke into a kind of pop princess phase where um she had writers who were based in London actually, and she had like some smash hits with pop songs that weren't necessarily especially sophisticated. I think it's maybe fair to say, um, but they were feel good and people enjoyed them and they did well. And she went from there into a phase where she was quite a bit more experimental and a bit more creatively challenging herself. Those albums didn't necessarily all hit number one in the same kind of way. She came back from there, reinvented herself again with a kind of enriched form of pop where she brings she makes pop music that makes people feel good, makes them dance, but also brings in other genres and other kind of elements. So it's quite creatively rich. And in that way, she's had 3 decades of like really high success, adapted herself as the times have changed, and yet people always remark that she's maintained a kind of steady sense of self at the same time. So I think there's something in there around this maybe the Cancer rising where she's got the exaltation ruler, Jupiter's in Leo, and that moon is in all of this stellium. What's really interesting is this entire stellium is in the 12th whole sign house. But if you
Mhm.
cast it in Placidus, it's spread across the 10th and 11th houses. And
Oh.
if you put those together, I think it works quite well because she's really built networks. She's really gone out of her way to lift other artists up. No one has a bad word to say about her. She's apparently a really nice person. So she uses her social media to praise other artists, and she's generally been kind and respectful to everyone from what I can gather. And I think that's a lovely kind of, and I suppose topical combination of the kind of mercurial and lunar
Mm.
significations that this whole episode is kind of about. So I thought that was a really lovely example, and where she's obviously multi-talented,
Mhm.
dance, vocals, composition, acting, and even just the way she's managed her career as a whole all show quite a lot of mental agility. And yeah, I thought she was a nice example of the Gemini moon there.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice example, and it's nice actually that you've got all that Gemini energy, but you've got that Cancer rising chart, which, yeah, like you said, kind of echoes what we've been talking about in terms of Cancer and Gemini. And I think it's so nice to hear that she's actually a nice person because quite often you find that a lot of these people who are in the limelight aren't actually very nice people. It kind of goes to their head or they kind of forget who they are. And I think that Cancer rising chart probably feeds into that girl next door, familiar, comfortable person
Mm.
that she is. And yeah, I remember singing, especially for you, in the primary school playground, pretending I was Kylie Minogue. Like when she came out, it was just such feel-good energy, even for like children. Like it was very, like I like that she is adaptable in terms of like her audience as well. She's probably got quite a wide range of like fan base because there'll be originals that watched her in Neighbours. Is it Neighbours? I get Neighbours and Home and Away mixed up. But you know, when back in the day when we only used to have 4 or 5 channels, I know that might be crazy for you Gen Z listening, but yes, we only had 4 or 5 channels. So we'd all be watching, you know, Neighbours and Home and Away. So she was like a staple on our TVs before we even kind of she segued into music. So it makes sense that she's got this massive stellium, but it's interesting that you said that it's in the 12th house, but then Placidus kind of shifts it slightly. And I think that's a really interesting example.
And if I could add one more thing, because you picked up
Mhm.
on the kind of broad appeal and the broad, diverse audience that she attracts, and she generally does, and she doesn't tend to, she tends to be quite kind of focused on kind of bringing joy. So she's got that youthful, joyous energy about her music and the way that she conducts herself. But one particular audience that she has had that have been remain very loyal throughout the 30 or so years is the LGBTQ community,
Mhm.
because
Yes.
not just because of that kind of joyous music that's very dancey and very fun, also because she has been an ally as well, very proactively. And I didn't find out until this morning about this, but she and her partner refused to get married until they changed the law in Australia to allow same-sex marriage. So it's the one kind of political intervention where, you know, she's been overtly supportive of the queer community, which I think is very cool as well. And again, maybe speaks to that the 11th house layer that's in there, and also she's got her midheaven in the 11th house and whole sign houses as well, ruled by the Venus and Gemini. So there's an element there of like maybe knowing her audiences and a good harmonious connection with her
Mm.
audiences as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it's interesting because you've chosen a chart where the Gemini moon is the actual chart ruler, like it's ruling that whole vibe. And I guess that put kind of reinforces the idea of the open-mindedness and curiosity rather than judgment. I love how Gemini kind of
Yeah.
turns away from judgment and is much more open and curious and free-spirited. And because they're free-spirited in their own kind of personal perspective, it means that they kind of afford that to others, that kind of live and let live and be unique, be quirky, be who you want to be, and be able to be comfortable in that. So I think that's you know, it sounds like she's like a really good advocate for that, which people probably pick up on when you've got that lunar energy just kind of shining through.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's bringing out the best of both, I think.
Mhm.
Do you want to maybe do one next and we'll
Yeah.
pass back and forth?
Yeah, that's good because they're quite different. So my first one, and forgive me, the chart is C rating. So we have an unknown rising, but I just really wanted to talk about C.S. Lewis. There's still quite a lot that we can talk about regardless of the fact that we don't know where the houses kind of fall. And what's interesting with this chart is he has a Gemini moon and Neptune and Pluto, but then he has a Sagittarius sun, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, and Uranus. So he's got a big Sagittarius stellium kind of opposing that Gemini moon. And outside of that, he only has a Leo Mars and a Scorpio Jupiter. So almost all of his planets are in that Gemini Sagittarius axis. And it's interesting because he spent a lifetime trying to synthesize like massive philosophical frameworks through very diverse forms of communication. And the reason why I love doing these deep dives into people is because for me, I kind of knew C.S. Lewis like a lot of people through his Chronicles of Narnia, but there's just so much more that he actually did. So before I move on to like his body of work, he actually grew up as an aggressive, that's what it actually said, an aggressive atheist. So it feels like his Gemini moon kind of fought hard against his Sagittarius stellium, which is obviously ruled by Jupiter, which is about faith and beliefs. But interestingly, his moon is ruled by that detriment Sagittarius Mercury. So while his kind of mercurial side wants data, logic, I don't know, intellectual consistency, um, I can see why you maybe at first kind of rejected the idea of God and grew up as an atheist. But then what's interesting is his shift to Christianity was actually sparked by a late night walk with his friend J.R.R. Tolkien, which I didn't know they were friends, besties, but J.R. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. And although C.S. Lewis loved ancient myths, he rationalized that they were just these beautiful fabricated lies, whereas Tolkien kind of used a really brilliant argument that these myths aren't lies, they're more the human mind reflecting kind of a shattered fragment of the truth, like of true divine light. I don't know the exact ins and outs, but it was enough to kind of, this idea essentially won him over. And it was almost like his Gemini moon was then satisfied because it no longer had to reject kind of logical historical fact to accept it. And there's a quote where he says, I succumbed and admitted that God was God. So I think that was quite interesting that, his Gemini moon was, I don't know, played probably a big part in kind of rejecting faith at first, but then it's almost like his Sagittarius stellium won over in the end. But also he had this incredible rare triple first from Oxford University. So his three triple firsts from Oxford were one in Greek and Latin literature, philosophy and ancient history, and then English language and literature. So very difficult to get a first from Oxford anyway, but to get three is just, not many people have done that. But then he also taught English literature at Oxford, and he finally left after years and years of being really strongly attached to Oxford to he became the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. And this was a position that they specially created for him because of his, how much he knew. And it's just interesting. Yeah, so I was just wondering where his Gemini and Sagittarius axes falls. And even if it didn't fall in the third and ninth house, it would be so interesting to see what's on that axis because the fact that he's, kept going back to university, getting all these degrees, taught, wrote, it's just so third, ninth house. And then when we move into his body of work, it's very eclectic, very Gemini, very mercurial. It's like his moon needed to express it in 100 different ways. Um, I think with Gemini, there's this duality that we probably haven't mentioned before, obviously because they're represented by the twins. And I think C.S. Lewis had this need to kind of turn his ideas over in a dialectical format, kind of pitting two opposing format forces against each other to find a deeper truth. He wrote something called the Screw Tape Letters, which is essentially written from the perspective of a senior devil advising a junior demon. So he was able to write satire from the enemy's point of view, which I think is classical Mercury ability to wear this kind of cognitive mask, but also he had very mutable kind of shape-shifting type of literary genre. He was an academic. He was obviously a children's author, so all of those Narnia books, but he also was a sci-fi pioneer. So he had a space trilogy that combined theology, astrophysics, and theology. And then he was also a radio broadcaster. I think he did wartime BBC broadcasts. So he was like the emotional anchor of something called the Inklings, which is a famous literary discussion group. So he didn't just write in isolation, he actually read his drafts out loud, receiving critique from people and firing back with kind of witty retorts. So it's quite interesting that, he also had to kind of bounce ideas off people to kind of get his creative juices flowing. And he was a philologist, which is like the study of the history of language, which is again very mercurial. And he wrote something called the Studies in Words because he had this infatuation with the precision of words. So yeah, I just think, yeah, we don't have a birth time for him, but his Gemini moon is very, very loud. And I think it's quite interesting. It's also again opposite this Sagittarium.
Wow, yeah, it's an incredible example, and it's interesting. It's got this opposition, especially if he was born in the later part of the day between the moon and Mercury. So there's those Mercury and lunar significations, but placed across the Gemini Sagittarius axis, manifesting in such a very different
Mm.
way than what we've seen, and that Mercury obviously ruling the moon as well as opposing it. So the moon's that there's definitely this really powerful mercurial sense in everything that you were saying, the speaking, the writing, the thinking from multiple perspectives and changing his mind. That's really quite fascinating. And then obviously he's also felt the need to kind of put this insight or this understanding into his work. Like if you read the Chronicles of Narnia, they're very there is very much a kind of a Christian
Mm.
worldview in there. And so, like, I wonder about, because I was thinking the same as you when you said which houses. It feels like third house, ninth house. That would give him either Aries or Libra rising, right? I think. So
Yeah.
there's a kind of cardinal, especially it would be fun if it was Aries, because there is something so almost headstrong about that. But that kind of, I'm just going to put
Yeah.
my ideas out there.
Yes. Yeah, no, I thought it was a real interesting one. And like you said, when you just pull up a chart and you don't really know what you're gonna see, and then it's like very loud. And that's why I think it's great when you've got famous examples, because yes, we don't know the ins and outs of everything, but there's so much out there that you can then just clearly see it in the chart. And I think going from an atheist to devout Christian is just peak Gemini Sagittarius.
And really fun as well because he's that moon is sandwiched, somewhere between the Pluto and Neptune in Gemini. So
Mm.
there's those generational Gemini influences that he's directly downloading, and then
Yes.
other personal planets in the mix as well. I think that's yeah, and he's like the channel for maybe quite a lot that's in the collective consciousness even.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't realize just how diverse his writing was. And so it makes complete sense that he had all these different ideas. And yeah, I mean, I was going to say I'll probably try and pick up one of his books and read it, but that's a lie because I've got so many books that I need to read already. So I'm not going to do the
Same.
Gemini thing by buying yet another book to not read. So who's your second example?
So the second example that I thought of for today is Steve Coogan. So Steve Coogan it's also an untimed birth chart, but I felt likewise that there was enough there to sort of and enough that strikingly fits the signification. So the moon is conjunct the North Node. The 12 p.m. chart is around 8 degrees of Gemini, so I think it's quite securely within the Gemini sign. And if it's around there in the middle of the day, it forms a kind of grand cross. So I definitely there's a sort of T square with Saturn and Mars, which is potentially quite difficult. And then there's a Uranus Pluto conjunction in Virgo, so that there's a mutable grand cross to some degree of tightness there. And Steve Coogan is known for incredible level of versatility. So he's an impressionist and he creates comedy characters. And for a long time, he was best known for his comedy work, especially Alan Partridge. But he made a point of showing quite early on in his career that he can also do serious acting. And the first time I saw him acting in something in that way was recently the Netflix series Legends, which is about undercover police work in the 1980s. So I was blown away like, how good he is as a kind of serious actor as well. And so there's that kind of versatility and mimicry and that sort of, just incredible range of communication that he's able to do. The moon is ruled by Mercury in Scorpio, and I love that because there's so much underlying his work is about his observations, keen observations about human nature and politics and what people are like. And when you listen, when you when you read interviews that he's done, it kind of comes through as well. Like he's not just witty and clever like you would associate with Gemini Moons, but also there's some really incisive, deep, um, interpretive, kind of sophisticated. He thinks things through, and I wonder if that, malefic and outer planet action has, that's not necessarily an easy thing for the moon being in a grand cross with those particular combination of planets. And so there's something there about, I don't know much about his personal life, but I
Mm.
would imagine that he's had some life experiences that have contributed to his penetrating insights, and that Scorpio Mercury, which is in a fairly tight trine with Jupiter in Cancer, which already suggests kind of an amplification of communication abilities, mental abilities, and so forth. I would imagine that not much gets past them, and that
Mhm.
then through the rulership of the moon, gives them that ability, that almost quite natural, innate ability to perform in ways that can communicate such a broad range of concepts to such a broad range of audiences.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I like don't know much about Steve Coogan, but I have watched his, I think it's called The Trip with Rob Brydon, and it's quite interesting, like kind of their conversational sparring that they see, which is obviously kind of an exaggerated, manufactured persona. But whenever I watch them in that, it's I kind of forget, are they playing themselves or are they doing a parody of themselves? I think it's very clever that the way that they do that, and a lot of the kind of genuine friendship that you can see between them is around this kind of constant picking at each other, but very cleverly and very witty. And it does kind of, there's a charm, I think, to Gemini as well that can kind of pull people in because they've got such this kind of way with words. It's very elegant.
I love that you mentioned that because I hadn't seen it either, but I had read about it, and it reminds me that something else I read about him is that he's got a lot of siblings.
Mm.
And of course, that can be another mercurial Gemini kind of a signification. You often see Gemini moons probably more than average with twins. And
Mm.
also, I'm also thinking about, Kylie Minogue. She's got a famous sister who's also a singer. And Emily Deschanel, who is the actress who played Bones, Temperance Brennan in the TV show Bones, she's got a famous sister as well, Zoe Deschanel. So I wonder, like sometimes there is something in what you were saying about Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon. I know they're friends, but I think there's a certain way of relating to friends and people that's kind of sibling-esque, and that good-natured banter kind of not quite argument, but the kind of back and forth. That's
Mm.
very familiar to people who grow up sharing a space with siblings. And I wonder if that energy actually comes through. And just a last throwaway thought as well, there's something small children do with siblings, which is the um like
Yeah,
mimicking
you're
people
right.
to kind of, and I'm just thinking that's and
Yeah,
maybe another echo of that kind
yeah,
of
teasing each other,
mercurial
winding each
sibling.
other up. Yeah, they kind of made
Yeah,
a pact that they were going to do that online, but it on screen, but it really comes across quite natural, and I can see that they have genuine kind of warmth for each other. And I think it's interesting what you said about twins and siblings because they don't look exactly alike, but there is a similarity to them. Like on, so I'm not saying they look like twins, but there is a similarity. They both look very similar. So I think that's quite interesting, pulling that up as well. No, really good example. Great. So to finish this up, I have got Freud as my example, and yeah, super, super interesting. Now this we do have a timed chart for him, which is great. So he was a Scorpio rising, which makes sense. And then is a Taurus sun. He actually has quite a big Taurus stellium in the seventh house, but then he has this eighth house Gemini moon. And I think it's interesting because he said the ego is not master in its own house. And I think it's interesting because he coins the term psychoanalysis. And I feel that his Gemini moon, especially in the eighth house, was likely to understand that the mind is a busy place. The Gemini is the archetype of a split narrative. And so when you think about the ego being kind of one part of us, but then we've got everything else. I think the ego is not the master in its own house is a really good way of trying to separate the mind from the spirit or the soul, and how kind of the psychoanalysis part of it comes into it. And the reason why I was drawn to Freud is because I actually have a Nightlight Astrology Speaker Series talk next month on the solar return ascendant, and I'm using Freud as an example. And essentially, the house that the solar return ascendant falls in the natal chart is like living life through a different lens in that particular year ahead. Now, in March 1895, this was when Freud coined the term psychoanalysis in one of his papers. It got published in March. And in that year, when it got published, he had a Gemini rising solar return chart. So this pulled in his natal eighth house, and this is where his moon and Saturn live. Now, because we've got Mercury as both the solar return chart ruler and the ruler of Freud's eighth house, the word psychoanalysis literally means bringing hidden thoughts and emotional conflicts into conscious awareness. Very eighth house, very mercurial. And I think his eighth house Gemini moon thrived on putting words to this kind of deep wordless kind of undercurrents of the psyche. And he was viewing his year through the lens of Gemini. So you've got hidden things, taboo, rationalizing, labeling, deep psychological investigation. And it's interesting because when he coined this term and it was kind of put out into the public, this was within the last 8 weeks of his solar return. He's born in May, and I do often find that you get a lot of key messages and significant events for both the year that's just gone and the year about to start in the like culmination of your solar return. I feel like it's like this kind of liminal space. So I know I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent, very Gemini, but I think it's really interesting that this term that we now all talk about in terms of like the psyche was born in this kind of year where his eighth house was brought to light, but also his moon, this mercurial moon, where he was able to kind of rationalize and label and be able to kind of really understand like what is actually going on in the mind, like how are we kind of existing subconsciously, and how can we kind of bring that to light.
Mean, that a fascinating tangent and also very relevant because you really brought to life that kind of, how in one particular year it came to prominence, but also he's living his life, through that eighth house lens almost with the sun there, sorry, with the moon there. And I thought it was interesting as well, just noticing that that moon is ruling his ninth house. So that's where you can find worldview, to some
Mhm.
extent, and in philosophy, and almost as if that ruler of the ninth and the eighth is also contributing to the that sense of he had a very very firm worldview actually, and it was quite contrarian for the day, but it did become quite he became quite dogmatic about it, quite fixed, which is fascinating considering that the open-mindedness of Gemini otherwise that we were kind of touching on, although the co-presence with Saturn, I know it's not very close, but I do wonder if that was an element to that as well, maybe.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point with the moon rule in ninth house. Really good to pick that up because I didn't. But I think the fixity is probably that Scorpio Taurus axis, because you've obviously got
Yeah.
Taurus at the helm, but no, so you've got the Scorpio at the helm, but then you've got this real massive kind of Taurian descendant seventh house on the angle. So I can see why there is probably this I don't know, dichotomy between this kind of open-mindedness and curiosity with Gemini, but then you've got all of this kind of, once I've made a decision, I'm not kind of moving from it. This is what it is. I'm gonna
Yeah.
stay with that. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, his chart. And
No,
once
it's
once I've been looking at it and just really enjoying it, like I don't know about you, get very attached to charts, and I've loved Van Gogh's chart for a long time, but this might be my new favorite one because there's so much there to unpick.
love it. Yeah, and he's such an interesting and well documented person, as well. And I love what you were saying about the fixed first house, seventh house axis, and Pluto is on the descendant as well. And it's an interesting echo of Jung's chart, Carl Jung, who they, had famously were very close and then had the
Mhm.
split,
Yeah.
who also had, although he was in Aquarius rising, but he also had his sun in the seventh house as well. So it's curious. I think it'd be really interesting to look in more depth at the synastry there. But yeah, fantastic. I don't think that Gemini moon necessarily gets that much attention. I'm not sure, so I'd love it if you end up writing anything about this chart.
Yeah. Well, maybe because it's in the eighth house, why it probably doesn't get as much attention. So yeah, I've really enjoyed our exploration. I think all four were very different, and I think that just is the epitome of Gemini. I think we were meant to talk a little bit about your progressed moon, and we didn't. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've experienced your Gemini progressed moon.
Sure. Yeah. I find it difficult. I wonder if, and I think I've mentioned before, I don't have a lot of air in my birth chart apart from those Gemini points. So it's been interesting. I think it's had a lot to do with energy and mental energy. I have struggled more than ever to stay focused and limit what I'm spending mental energy on because I find myself, and I know it's too much, but I find myself with my mind too active, thinking about too many things too much of the time. And it's quite, I'm finding it kind of draining, but also compulsive, like where I just kind of want to, I can't seem to stop myself from starting new things and doing too many things simultaneously. And um, I think that's definitely been, and I checked this morning, and I'm kind of almost halfway through that Gemini moon progressed transit. I think it's like 12 degrees. So there's definitely been a sense of it deepening, and it's been connected with the Uranus ingress intimately because
Mm.
the when
Yes.
Uranus first crossed in last summer, they went in at exactly pretty much the same minute, and then Uranus obviously retrograded back out, but is now back in Gemini. So this is my sixth house in whole sign houses, and so it's been a lot to do with the daily life and the kind of relentless curiosity. I would say I'm kind of a bit like that anyway, but it's been maybe more so.
Yeah, I was going to say that I picked upon your word compulsive, which I know we're both neurodivergent, so that's probably just a natural part of our MO. But I do think that compulsiveness does point to the Mercury kind of sometimes you can't switch it off. Like Mercury just keeps going, and sometimes you just want to be able to quieten that noise. I remember having my progressed moon in Gemini and similar, just it's like you just can't stop yourself from wanting and needing to do so many different things. But yeah, I think especially talking, looping it back to the new moon, ruled by that Cancer Mercury, I think it's definitely going to be less about doing, thinking, and more just about feeling if we can, definitely. But yeah, Uranus, I keep forgetting that Uranus is early degrees of Gemini, so that's coloring everything as well.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that kind of wraps things up, which is, monumental given that we've gone through all 12 signs. Like I said, it's been a pleasure co-hosting you with this, and we are going to do a one-off kind of special, coinciding with the new moon in Cancer, but just to kind of send a send-off to Jupiter that's been exalted in Cancer. And yeah, it's been the necessary balm with all of the crazy kind of astro weather we've had. So it'd be nice to kind of touch base on that as well.
Yeah, I look forward to that. And it has been great just to have that lunar focus with Jupiter there in Cancer, just supporting the effort and giving us a sort of frame for thinking it through and really paying that attention to the lunar transits each month and talking to some really brilliant astrologers along the way and getting the benefit of their lived experience as well as, I've also loved the ones where you and I
Mm.
have been pulling out famous people because it's just beautiful when in both cases when you sort of when the symbolism and the actuality just line up so well, and it's been a great tour around the zodiac in that sense.
No, it has, and we've got to wait another 12 years before it's exalted. So let's, bask in it while we can before it moves into crazy Leo. But yeah, to our listeners, as always, thank you for listening and for bringing your own energy and attention to this topic. And we'll see you next time when we kind of wrap everything up.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. See you then, everyone. Bye.
Bye.